Welcome to the first of two lectures on chapter 20, which focuses on the lymphatic system and then the lymphoid organs. This lecture is going to focus on primarily the lymph system, how this kind of series of vessels, similar to blood vessels, that collect kind of the excess fluid that the blood vessels don't pick up and kind of return it to the body's circulation. And that includes things like lymph nodes that are kind of in this lymphatic system. And then the second lecture will focus more on the kind of the organs of the lymphoid system. So when we're looking at the lymphatic system, and when we're particularly talking about like the lymphatic vessels, what we're talking about is this kind of series of tubes similar to our circulatory system that picks up the fluid that gets leaked out, right? So remember that on the arterial end of our capillary bed, we get all of this kind of fluid and solutes that get pushed out mostly by hydrostatic pressure. Well, a good chunk of that fluid and solutes gets reabsorbed on the venule end of the the blood capillary, but not all of it makes it back into the blood capillary. There's still this kind of fluid and solutes that are here in the interstitial spaces. Well, the lymphatic system is then a series of vessels, starting with the lymphatic capillaries, moving through the collecting vessels, which will usually have some lymph nodes kind of scattered throughout, which kind of filter the lymph. The lymph collecting vessels merge into what we call lymphatic trunks, and then the trunks then merge into lymphatic ducts, and then the ducts dump all this other fluid that didn't make it back here. They dump it into the venous system, kind of right up by the jugulars and subclavians, but right back before it goes back to the heart and goes to the arterial system again. The lymphatic system is also what we consider the structural basis for our immune system. So typically we study the lymphatic system and the immune system kind of as two halves of a whole, where the lymphatic system is kind of the structure, the building blocks, as it were, the kind of skeleton of a building, and then the immune system is more kind of functional. How do all these little parts kind of work together? The lymphatic system also has a bunch of phagocytic cells in it, particularly in our lymph nodes, that kind of filter and clean out this excess fluid. So when we talk about the lymphatic system and we're talking about the kind of system of vessels, we also have to talk about the fluid that's in the vessels. That fluid is referred to as lymph. It's, of course, very similar to blood plasma, but slightly different compositions in terms of electrolytes and things like that. And then the lymph nodes, and they are found kind of throughout the body with some kind of aggregate collections in a couple of particular places. So we're going to start with the capillaries and kind of work our way through the series of lymphatic vessels. The lymph capillaries are quite similar to our blood capillaries that we've looked at before, except they're a little more permeable. They can get bigger particles in them than your blood capillaries typically can. And that's because stuff that's out in the interstitial fluid might contain a lot of proteins. It might have some cellular debris. There might be something pathogenic or maybe some sort of cancerous cell. And we want to be able to get that stuff into the lymph system so that the immune cells that are in the lymph system can kind of take a crack at some of that. The endothelial cells lining the lymph capillaries, they overlap real loosely, so there's no tight junctions here, and you get these little kind of like mini valves, little flaps that kind of open and close, and they get anchored by the collagen kind of surrounding that prevents the lymph capillaries from kind of collapsing in on themselves. But when the interstitial fluid gets a little more volume to it, then it kind of presses on those little mini valves, and they kind of open up the flap. The flap kind of opens so that fluid and solutes and proteins and all that stuff out there can get into the lymph capillary. That the venous capillary end is just really too tight. But the lymph capillaries are quite permeable. So the lymph capillaries are found pretty much everywhere in the body, excuse me, not the bottle. I was looking at my water bottle there. We don't find them in the bones. We don't find them in our teeth or our bone marrow. And we also don't find them in our central nervous system. And that's because the central nervous system actually uses the cerebrospinal fluid to kind of drain its excess fluid that doesn't make it back into the dural sinuses. You also find very specialized lymphatic capillaries in the intestines, particularly if we're looking at the small intestines where most of the absorption of the lipids takes place. These are called lacteals. They're the ones that actually, so unlike all of our other nutrients that get absorbed by the enterocytes of the small intestine, and then all those nutrients go into the blood and then into the hepatic portal system, fat actually goes into these lacteals first before it gets into the blood system. So a slightly different little process there for the digestion of, the absorption of fatty acids and things like that. So kind of branching off of the lymphatic capillaries are then the lymphatic collecting vessels. And these are quite similar to the veins of our circulatory system, except that the walls are even thinner and they have a lot more valves. They also anastomose a lot, so they make lots of little junctions with other collecting vessels. We have sets of collecting vessels kind of both superficially and deep in our body. The collecting vessels that are real superficial tend to kind of travel with those real superficial veins, like, the basilic or the cephalic in the arm, the great and small saphenous in the limbs, the lower limbs. Those are very superficial veins, and typically surrounding those more superficial veins, you'll find a whole series of lymphatic collecting vessels. The deeper vessels tend to kind of follow the same pathway as our arteries. And the big lymphatic collecting vessels, just like the big arteries and veins, do also have vasa vasorum to supply their own oxygen and nutrients. The collecting vessels merge into what we call a lymphatic trunk, which then kind of drain these large areas of the body, and their name kind of tells you which part of the body that they drain. So for instance, the intestinal trunk is going to drain the intestines. Right and left lumbar are going to drain those kind of more posterior parts of the body there. Also, our kind of lower limbs go into these lumbar trunks. You have bronchiomediastinal trunks on both the right and the left, which are doing more kind of thorax. The subclavians on both right and left are going from the upper limbs, and then the jugular trunks on the right and left are coming from head and neck. The lymphatic trunks then merge into what we call lymphatic ducts. And the ducts are a little different because the right lymphatic duct does the right upper arm and the right head and thorax, and then everything else, left upper arm, left head and thorax, and the entire lower part of the body are drained by what we call the thoracic duct. And the thoracic duct actually starts out as this kind of enlarged kind of sac. We call it the cisterna chyli, and that's getting all of the circulation, lymphatic circulation anyway, from the lower limb. And then both the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct then connect to the venous circulation pretty much at the junction of the internal jugular and the subclavian veins on either the right side of the body if we're talking about the right lymphatic duct, or the left side of the body if we're talking about the thoracic duct. I'll show you what I mean in just a second. So first, let's look at kind of where they're coming from. So here's your right lymphatic duct. Here is the thoracic duct, and you can see here's this kind of large sac that's getting all the kind of lower circulation in terms of from the intestines and from the lower limbs. That thoracic duct then dumps the fluid right here. The right lymphatic duct then dumps the fluid right here. Pretty much, again, like I said, at the junction of the two internal jugulars and the two subclavian veins coming from the limbs. And again, right head, chest, upper limb gets drained by the right lymphatic duct, left head, chest, left upper limb, and all of the abdominal lymphatic circulation, all of the lower limb circulation, it's all going into the cisterna chyli and then into the thoracic duct. So it's a little different on the right and left side of the body in terms of lymphatic drainage. Lymph itself, the system of collecting vessels, it's a pretty low pressure system, so it's very similar to the venous system in that way, and it has kind of similar mechanisms for kind of getting all of that lymph fluid kind of back up to where it gets back into the circulatory system. And so we have that milking action by our skeletal muscles, right? The relaxation and contraction of the skeletal muscles that surround the lymph vessels that kind of suck the fluid and kind of push the fluid all together up. The pressure changes in our thorax, right? When we breathe, that changes the pressure in our thoracic cavity. That is kind of a vacuum pulling this fluid up. They've got the valves to prevent the backflow, just like the veins do. Actually, the arteries, if they're one of those deeper lymphatic vessels that are traveling with the arteries themselves are kind of pulsatile, right? Because they've got the beat of the heart behind them. That can also kind of help to kind of milk some of this back to the ducts. And then there's, of course, smooth muscle in the walls of the vessels, and that contraction can also kind of help them get back there. And the really kind of interesting thing is, I don't know if you've ever wondered about, okay, why when am I injured, why am I supposed to immobilize it, right? Rest, what is the RICE? Rest, ice, compression, and elevation, and immobilization, right? They tell you to sit, don't put activity on it. Well, activity actually increases the flow of your lymph because it increases the milking action of your skeletal muscles. And so that's why they typically tell you to be immobilized during some sort of healing period, because if you immobilize that area and you don't use it as much, that keeps all the inflammation and all the lymph cells and all the immune cells kind of in the area that's damaged, and so you will heal faster, which is kind of an interesting thing to learn about. Why is it just am I supposed to stay off my feet when I injure something? So I think that's kind of neat. So let's now kind of talk about not just the lymph system, not this series of vessels and the fluid within, but now let's talk about the cells and the tissues that make up the lymphoid organs. So when we're talking about the cells that are associated with the lymphatic system, we have the immune part, kind of functional part, and then the structural part, which is the reticular cells. In terms of the functional part, we're going to talk about lymphocytes, so T cells and B cells, as you'll see in just a second. Macrophages, which are kind of those big eating cells that kind of glom onto things and suck them in and kind of absorb them that way. And then dendritic cells, which are somewhat similar to macrophages. So let's talk about the lymphocytes first. So lymphocytes, one of our white blood cells, are pretty much kind of the main part of your immune army. As with all blood cells, they start in the red bone marrow, and then some of them actually migrate, some of them don't. But they become one of two kind of varietals. We have the T lymphocytes, or the T cells, or the B lymphocytes and the B cells. And they're both parts of the adaptive immune system, as we're going to talk about when we get to chapter 21, but they function in slightly different ways. But both of them protect against what we call an antigen. We've seen the word antigen before, particularly talking about kind of blood typing, but actually antigens can also, everything that is around you also has antigens as well. And so when your body sees an antigen that doesn't belong to it, such as maybe some bacterial toxin or a virus or, mismatched red blood cells, then the body says, hey, that doesn't belong to me. I need to get rid of it. And that's what then it'll kind of send the T cells and B cells out to do. So T cells provide what we call cellular immunity, and that's because there are a population of T cells themselves that can actually go and attack something that's infected and destroy that infected cell. B cells provide what we call humoral immunity. We've seen that word humoral before, talking about how, say for instance, calcium is a humoral stimulus for the release of the parathyroid hormone. Well, B cells mature into what we call plasma cells. Those plasma cells then secrete antibodies, and the antibodies go and kind of attach to the antigens and say, hey, guess what, this antigen is foreign, we need to get rid of it. And so it's a slightly different process because the B cells themselves are not attacking and destroying the infected cell. It's a humoral immunity because they work through the action of antibodies, not their own kind of cellular kind of attack. Macrophages, they're again a phagocytic cell, as I mentioned earlier. They also play a role in activating our T cells. And then dendritic cells are these kind of huge cells that they're called an antigen-presenting cell, as we're going to talk about here in chapter 21. But they basically find an antigen and then bring that antigen to T cells and B cells to kind of activate them, particularly the T cells. In terms of structural components, we're talking about reticular cells. We're talking about reticular tissue. It makes that kind of mesh or stroma out of these reticular fibers, and then that kind of makes the web that all the other lymph cells sit in. So here's the reticular fibers kind of making the web, and you can see you've got macrophages sitting in it, you've got lymphocytes sitting in it, kind of being held in place there. Our lymphoid tissue, again, is largely reticular connective tissue. It's where we find our lymphocytes. It gives them a place to kind of develop, to proliferate, I can't say that word today. It also gives them a place from which they can kind of survey the body and look for things that are foreign to us. Lymphoid tissue is typically of two types, what we call diffuse, which is kind of spread out, and we find lymphoid tissue in just about every body organ, where you have a little collection of lymph cells, immune cells kind of keeping a watch for you. You do tend to find kind of bigger collections of these in our mucous membranes, GI tract, tonsils, and we're going to talk about a couple of those in a second. And then we have what we call follicles or nodules. And these are really kind of tightly packed lymph cells or reticular fibers with what we call in the center a kind of germinal center, and that's where the B cells then proliferate. And very often you will find these kind of really dense spherical collections of lymph follicles in some of our larger lymphoid organs, like the lymph nodes, like the Peyer's patches in the GI tract, and like in the appendix and the tonsils and so on and so forth. And that's what the second part of this lecture is going to focus on, is the various lymphoid organs.